welcome everyone. And get ready because this is the panel where we define the future of Bitcoin right here and now. But in all seriousness, a lot has been said about soft forks and hard forks and upgrades and changes. So here we're going to distill a bit what that all means and what might be coming to Bitcoin. Everybody has been introduced already, so we can jump right in. To start, perhaps a little bit of context. So a soft fork is a change to the Bitcoin protocol that seeks to also be backwards compatible, right? So you have older clients being able to communicate with the newest ones back and forth. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's like half of it, but say the other really important thing that's maybe a little more subtle is with soft forks, not only like will your node run, but if I'm making use of a soft fork and I send you money, you will still see that money in your wallet. You know, it might take a confirmation, but it will get to you. Yeah,
that's pretty fair. And I think when we hear the word change, we get some goosebumps, right? Because, well, Bitcoin works, right? I can pull up my phone, spin up a node, I can send money without permission, with no double spend anywhere else in the world, right? So should we keep changing Bitcoin? Isn't Bitcoin fine? Should we risk changing Bitcoin? I think we saw ordinals as like an unintended consequence of two soft forks. Should we keep changing, or is Bitcoin fine?
I kind of want to push back on the ordinals thing because it's complicated, but really you could have done ordinals before the fork that was, I guess, 2 years ago. The soft fork that's most recent was the Taproot soft fork, but you could have done ordinals before that. It was the only real difference that enabled it was standardness, which is not part of the soft fork. But in the general sense, like, yeah, soft forks are in some ways kind of contradictory in that we have this decentralized system, so like no one can decide what's happening and no one can coordinate it. But we need coordination. We need sort of a higher level consensus in order to change it, and we don't actually want that. We want the Nakamoto consensus, the block size, the hash power to sort of determine what's correct. And if we have this higher level, it's sort of like not great. And I think that eventually, no matter what we want, eventually if Bitcoin continues to get bigger, we won't be able to change it. So I think the example I always think of is like IPv4 and IPv6, where I remember being in high school and they're like, yeah, IPv6 in a couple of years, 20-something years ago, and I've still never had an IPv6 address.
Currently, worldwide, about 45% of Google's traffic is IPv6.
So it's happening.
So be careful with that example. It's not as good an example as people think it is.
But 25 years to still not quite get there. And it's not, and everyone who's working on, protocols.
But I got to point out, IPv6 is closer to the equivalent to a hard fork.
That's true. If IPv6 was a soft fork, we would have gotten it. But it's very hard to change things when they're very big. And if Bitcoin becomes like the size of the internet, where there's just billions of people and so much on it, it's just really hard to coordinate anything at that point. And I think, yeah, Bitcoin will become sort of ossified whether we like it or not. And the question is, okay, can we make some interesting changes before that happens? So.
There are unintended consequences to changing Bitcoin. There are also unintended consequences to leaving it unchanged. And one of them is if people can't find a way to do the thing that they want to do on Bitcoin, they'll go do it somewhere else. And so you might see a lot more people using Liquid, for example. And that's not intended. We would like them to be using Bitcoin. But maybe they start using that because they can do fancy soft fork stuff on there and that they can't do on Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's certainly a fine line to walk, right? Change it too much and it becomes something else, but not changing and then you risk falling off a cliff in terms of adoption.
I mean, I also got to point out, like, I think the sort of risks we've kind of talked about are sort of more like existential risks, but there's also very real risk. Every time you do a new soft fork, you can easily add bugs. And, if all that happens is you happen to go have a fork in the chain that resolves itself in, a day, Well, multiply 144 blocks times how much miners are earning per day, and it is a lot of money. Purely on the money lost to miners, let alone on the money, lost due to the ecosystem not working, the, hit to the reputation, etc. So, there's a very high bar to creating a fork that you're very confident actually works. And a good example of this is, my own check lock time verify fork, which is like 6 lines of code or something. There's, like 50 lines of comments on the code explaining in detail every single thing did, plus like another 500 lines of unit tests in 2 years of discussion.
And that was a fast one. That was the last fast fork, because everything after that was SegWit, which took years, and Taproot and stuff. So.
Yeah, I think it comes down to how can we be sure that there are no bugs if we even can, right? And I think a phrase that is very often referred to is technical consensus, right? So it's like this magical phrase that if this upgrade that we want to do has technical consensus, then it's less likely that it's going to have any bugs or something like that. But that begs the question, how do we achieve technical consensus? And what even is it? Like, is it something that you can point out?
I mean, I think it's a term that seems easy to define at first, and it would be in the absence of bad faith. If people all had the same kind of vision of what Bitcoin would be, it'd be relatively easy to get technical consensus, because you'd say, all right, how many people who we all think are experts in Bitcoin have looked at that and said, yeah, this is a good idea? And that's one level of technical consensus. You go onto GitHub and you count how many acts there are. But the other level of technical consensus is this type of change a good idea? And that soon veers into politics. And I think that's what happened with SegWit, where on a part of the community, there was very clear technical consensus this was a good idea. But there was another part of the community which said, well, SegWit's a terrible idea. We should increase the block size, and we shouldn't do Lightning. And of course, we all know which side won. But from a pure outsider trying to go describe that situation, it becomes very difficult to say, well, which side had technical consensus and which side didn't. I'd say, as an insider, yeah, one side was just crazy. But it's hard to make that argument in a general way.
I have a sort of story about, because I remember, SIPA announced it at Hong Kong Scaling Bitcoin, and I had to talk right after his. I'm like, oh, I'm not going to top that. Like, come on. This was sort of a new idea, because SegWit had been an idea, but the ability to do it as a soft fork and also have a block size increase at the same time was like really surprising to everyone there. And everyone was like clapping and cheering. And I was sitting next to Joseph Poon, who I wrote the Lightning Network paper with, and he was really excited. And I was like, no, this is going to be a mess. And he's like, what do you mean? This is amazing. It's problem solved. Let's just do that. And I'm like, look over there. And there's all these people who at the time were, into Bitcoin and later become sort of Bitcoin Cash people. And it's like Roger, I'm like, because his talk was in the beginning, and I was like, they didn't even get to say what their idea was. Their ideas weren't as good, right? But maybe if the talks had just been in a different order that day at that conference, we wouldn't have had Bitcoin Cash spin-off. Who knows? But it is like a personal and sort of political thing. Like, hey, I didn't get my say in before you just showed this amazing technical achievement that we're all going to do. So that could have been part of it. Who knows? It's all people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely, even though we're talking about developers, politics does get into it, right? And
I mean, I recently came up with a potential soft fork that's, I think is a important improvement to Lightning channels. And, I don't think that it's worth getting into details. But from a political side, I think it will be very interesting to go see if I can get that soft fork through. Because in this case, you would think the technical community of Bitcoin's decided that, Lightning channels are a good thing. Now, obviously, maybe I'm wrong about the technical side of this. Maybe I missed that. But if I'm correct, you would think that soft fork would be easy to get through. And we'll find out in 3 years.
In 3 years, exactly. Super Testnet, I wonder if you have any ideas around this topic, and if there is a specific soft fork that you think should have a similar play than what Peter Todd has in his back pocket.
I don't know I haven't read Peter Todd's soft fork proposal. One of the ones that I think would be really good to get in is OpsCTV, check template verify. If I had to vote for what would be the next soft fork, that one would have my vote. Okay,
we're getting to the interesting part. Who wants OpCTV? Raise your hand. No, I'm just joking.
No one? Oh, okay.
Who knows why they want it?
That's actually a good question. So, Super Testnet, since you are defining here your approval or ACK for OpCTV, perhaps we should take a step back and look at covenants more broadly. Like, what are covenants and why do we need them?
Covenants are a type of Bitcoin transaction in which you restrict where the Bitcoins can be sent. An example might be cursing your Bitcoins. You put some Bitcoins in an address, and once they go into that address, they're cursed. They can only go to Alice, or they can only go to Bob, or maybe they can only go to 50% to Alice, 50% to Bob. And that's different from the way Bitcoin addresses work today, where when you send money into an address, as long as you have the private key, you can send them wherever you want. With covenants, you make it so that they can only go to some set of destinations that are specified in the script that makes that address.
Okay, so that's very...
But I got to point out, I mean, it's funny, we're talking about CTV, and CTV, like, you're correct, your description, but CTV just isn't that type of covenant. You know, I certainly wouldn't have led with that. I would have led with, well, yeah, CTV lets you say what the next transaction or potential other ones will do, but nothing more. Because CTV isn't recursive, and that's a really important point.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day.
No, I mean, yeah, because CTV, you can't have it be perpetual, right? So that's one of the worries. The idea of covenants has been around. I mean, if you look in Bitcoin talk, like probably 2014 or something, I'm sure Greg Maxwell, no, I remember he had a thing about it and was very negative. And was like, no, we need to make sure, I think he called it like a homeowners association. I don't know if that's a thing in Brazil, but in America there's a lot of weird covenants that are real estate things. And it's a weird thing where you're like, normally a contract is between two parties. It's like, hey, I'll pay you money and you build me a porch or something. But there can be these covenants that sort of run with land. And it's like, this land that you bought must have cows on it. And you're like, well, wait, I don't want cows. It's like, nope, the land has to have cows. And you're like, who have I pledged this to? So, yeah.
I mean, that example sounds a little less ridiculous when you say, well, I want the land to have trees on it in a nice park. But certainly there's examples where, covenants can be really nasty for society. But, like I say, CTV just isn't that type of covenant.
Yeah. So part of the idea of CTV is if you can make a recursive covenant in Bitcoin where you could say, okay, if I send to this address, now only a government-approved address can receive from it, can get sent to, and that continues on forever, then that's feels dangerous. OpCTV doesn't have that because before you enter into the covenant, you need to specify how it ends, right? So it's a limited sort of duration. Like it may be very long, it may be a chain of hundreds or thousands or millions of transactions, but you have to specify the endpoint at the beginning. So it's pretty limited in that sense.
And I think it's important to point out as well, because when we hear that you're going to limit where the Bitcoin is going to be spent to, is like, first thing that comes to your head is like censorship, right? But I think it's important to point out that only you, the owner, can limit your own UTXO that you want to spend and where. And so that comes with some nice features, such as a vault, right? You can set up a vault. You can increase security of your stack. And so what are some other benefits that covenants can bring us?
I mean, I think, first of all, I think vaults are really overrated. I don't think they're as useful as people think they are. But I think like where covenants could be much more useful is sort of deep in the weeds of how you implement certain types of Lightning-like protocols and extensions to Lightning. And unfortunately for a general audience, explaining why you need these gets quite complex because it really gets down to exactly how these smart contracts work. A simple example to give is like with Lightning, in some points you might have a huge transaction containing all these like HTLCs for all the payments in flight at once. And that might be a very big transaction. They don't necessarily want to have to mine immediately because everyone else might be trying to mine them at the same time. And potentially certain types of covenants like CTV could be used to add a bit of a delay to when this has to actually happen, to give you more breathing room for when exactly you need to go pay transaction fees. Maybe you delay them a little bit and you can pay a lower fee. But like I say, I mean, that really gets into the weeds how they work. And it's more about, all right, can we make Lightning better?
Yeah, and I mentioned in the last talk too, but you could do stuff with Lightning. I don't know if you even call it Lightning at that point with OpCTV, where there's multiple parties, where you could say, okay, there's 10 people in a channel. It's not really a channel anymore, but using OpCTV, we can say any one person can leave this channel, and then 9 can remain. And you know, there's not. Maybe there's a way to do that without OpCTV, and that's something that people have been thinking about, myself as well, for years. And it's just like, man, with 2, it's really doable. Once you get to 3, it's like way harder, but OpCTV does let you do that, you know, have multiple parties sharing a UTXO.
And of course, this one of the challenges I think CTV has faced, which is, you know, that exact example is one where, well, maybe CTV isn't quite the right tool. Maybe like op-check multi-sig in
Op-evict.
tree. I mean, I forget the names of these things. Like there's literally like 10 different proposals.
Yeah.
And all right, which one do you go pick? Which one do you go take that risk of upgrading a, you know, $500 billion system on? Because you really want the upgrade to be worth it and to have a really clear, well-defined use case. You know, like my own check locked on verify opcode, when that was proposed, everyone was convinced it was a good idea. You know, if you liked the idea of payment channels, obviously you would want check locked on verify. Sure enough, Lightning does in fact use it in certain cases.
I think with OpCLTV, people thought we already had it.
Yes.
So part of the description I think you said was like, it's what you thought lock time already was, but isn't. And you're like, oh, well then we need that because we thought we already could do that. And to some extent, OpCTV is like, yeah, it's very limited, but it does sort of intuitively feel like, yeah, you should be able to do something like that, but the hard part is the something like that. Like OpCTV is sort of as small and limited as you can get. And so and the reason was because initially people were worried, like, oh, we don't want to make it too powerful, there could be bugs. And then, you know, Jeremy made this very limited thing. And then the argument is, well, it's not powerful enough. It's like, well, wait, do you want it simple? Do you want it powerful? So that's the debate. Yeah.
I'd like to point out that every soft fork adds a new rule to Bitcoin, and a rule is a type of restriction. So if you're not, it might sound scary when someone says we want to add a soft fork that makes it so you can't spend your Bitcoins in a certain way. That might sound like, well, I don't want that. I want total freedom in how I spend my Bitcoin. But then just don't use it. Don't use that soft fork if you don't want the new features it brings. But in order to make new functionality, you have to make new rules, and every rule restricts the way that if you use that rule, it makes it so you can't spend your Bitcoin with as much freedom as you would have been able to before.
I should point out, like with Taproot, we added a whole set, you know, I think it's something like 80 or 100 new opcodes that are all called op success 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera. And it's quite a funny thing because op success just means if this opcode is hit in script evaluation, it immediately returns true, you can spend the money. And that's an example of the kind of rule that you will restrict. You'll say, well, obviously we have 100 different ways of spending money that bypass every rule you could imagine, but if you add a new rule to them, now you can go turn this into something you'd actually use, such as, well, maybe op success 1 is now op success, you know, or sorry, op, you know, check template verify, right? Because it's now saying, well, rather than just return true, we check a rule and then maybe we return true.
Yeah, and I think 2 points that were hit on right here I think are key, because one is the horrific word maybe, right? Because maybe there is something better, or maybe this will not work, or maybe there will be an issue. And so I think it comes back down to the technical consensus and the politics and all that. And we saw Jeremy get so frustrated that he dropped out completely. But we do have a lot of covenant proposals, right? I know, for instance, Jeremy himself said that he wanted to do CTV as like this small logical step up that, yes, is not recursive, but recursive scary, so no. But yeah, then we hit the point of, well, might be too small, but maybe there is a safer type of recursive. So I wanted to understand why among all the proposals CTV has been getting the most attention, and why it's kind of like in the spotlight as of late.
I think that other people have been researching. I know, like James O'Byrne is looking at OpVault, and it sort of comes to the conclusion that anything you're doing is going to give rise to opctv. It's sort of like, well, how can you make any covenants without this opctv type of functionality in it? Like, you can do things that are more powerful, but it does seem that that's sort of the least powerful thing that does any of this. So if you had some kind of check sig from stack or other types of transaction introspection, you also get the opctv functionality from that. So it looks like people are sort of thinking that, like, whatever we do, we get opctv. Any of these covenant kind of things. So that's sort of like, well, maybe start with the most simple one. Yeah.
Of course, to be clear, it's not clear that any of this covenant stuff's actually useful enough that we really need it. Again, this isn't like Lightning where it was very, very clear we needed something like this. I just don't think you can make that same clarity of argument for other stuff. And, that was my criticism of Jeremy Rubin.
Maybe we don't need covenants.
Well, yeah, and that's a big, important maybe, because my criticism of Jeremy Rubin when he put out his BIP was, look, you just have not argued well enough for why we need this. Your examples are not that important. Some of them are just bad examples because they don't really do what you want. If you're going to argue something is really needed, that should be the first thing you go cover and explain very clearly, this is why we actually need this stuff. And I just think he failed to do that. Where I'd say other soft forks we've done, it was a much more clear example. I mean, I'll give actually another one that's little known, which is we changed how time locks worked, so that rather than the time lock being against the time in the block, it was against a time called the median time passed. Which the important thing is miners can't control that. That soft fork, well, how do you go argue for that? Well, you just go say in one paragraph, hey, here's how miners can go manipulate things in ways we don't want. And that's why that soft fork got through so easily that most people don't even know it happened.
Yeah, and yes, Super Testnet, I was about to hand it over to you. Perhaps you could help us make the case or help us understand why CTV.
There are two things that I want to build that would be a lot easier to build if I had CTV. One of them is ARC, and the other one is with Lightning or channel factories on Lightning. Both of them get a lot easier if you have the ability to restrict where money goes. In a channel factory, you want to have assurance that if you put money into this channel factory, you're going to get the same amount out that you put in. And with ARC, you have the same property. If you're going to deposit money with an ARC service provider, you want assurance that you're going to get the same amount back that you put in there. And you can kind of do that today with pre-signed transactions. It's very interactive, especially when you get multiple people involved. But CTV makes it a lot easier. You don't have to interact with anyone. You just have to check that the address is what it should be. And then if it is, good, you can safely deposit your money there. So just because of that, because I could immediately use it, I want it.
Yeah, there's sometimes these sort of chicken egg problems. Any pre-vout or checks. SIG hash no input is a similar problem where you have L2 or some other ideas. I think people call it LN symmetry now, where it's interesting. And so it's like, okay, well, if we had a SIG hash type any pre-vout, we could do these things. But then some people are like, well, is it really any better? We already have Lightning. This is very similar. Is this really an improvement? And so people don't put in as much effort to build out this technology so we can say, here's the software. Look, if we have any pre-vout, we do all these amazing things, because they're not sure that it'll ever get in. And I totally understand how frustrating it is. And so one of the things I've worked on is U3XO, and a big part of the design was like, okay, I can't make this require a soft fork. If I can do it without a soft fork, then I know I don't have to convince Peter Todd that it's good, and I don't have to get his ACK on GitHub, and so I can get it to work anyway. And so a big part is if you can design something without needing a soft fork, it's just so much nicer. You have so much more assurance that it'll work. But if you can't and you really want, or if you just really want them because it makes it so much easier, then yeah, we have to advocate for it and try to potentially write a bunch of software that never gets used, which is a really tricky thing to start doing.
One thing I think might help. If you made ARC and channel factories in the way we can do them today, we could maybe fit something like 10 people into one of these structures before it would get too unwieldy where no one could coordinate to make all these pre-signed transactions. And if we did that and it was successful and if it was popular, then that might be a reason to say, now let's add CTV so we can take it from 10 to 100. So I'd like to see that. It might make the case more for these soft forks if we were doing them in the way we can do them now, in the inefficient way, and that became popular, that might give more added oomph to making it happen with the soft fork.
I mean, that's also been like one of my arguments with vaults where, if vaults are useful, something that's nearly the same thing is to go have a semi-trusted third party actually manage the thing that, makes the vault happen. And those wallets just haven't caught on yet. I mean, as it is, like multi-sig wallets are not actually that common. And I would consider it a precondition to go show that at least people are actually using multi-sig wallets and using these sort of, pseudo-trusted vaults to go say that we really need to go put support for vaults into Bitcoin itself. And I just, like I say, I just think you need to make that argument in a way that something like payment channels didn't need to because it was so much more clearly useful.
But wouldn't that come back to the chicken and egg problem that Tadge was mentioning? Because one could make the case that multi-sig is not widespread because of some of the difficulties around it. And so,
but multi-sig's already supported completely in every way we could want in the Bitcoin protocol. The chicken and egg thing, well, we have the egg, and now the question is how do we hatch the chicken? And also, I'll go push back again saying, well, we had a chicken and egg problem with Lightning, but people were convinced enough it was a good idea that we made it happen. There was no chicken and egg in that case. Like, we just figured out how to go make both at once. But again, Lightning was just a much more clearly useful thing than a lot of these other constructs.
I mean, when I started writing LND, it was not assuming SegWit. I was like, well, let's assume, sig hash no input or something, because it wasn't, and then it became clear that SegWit would happen. So I was like, okay, let's write the code for that. Lightning had a little bit more flexibility in that you didn't have the soft forks. You could maybe get something that kind of worked. But yeah, but that's always a risk that people work on with Bitcoin, even when it's not a soft fork. Like I know talking to James O'Byrne, he's been working on Assume UTXO for years, and it's scary. It's like, is this ever going to actually get in? Like, maybe you just work for 3 years and then it just dies. I think actually Assume UTXO is going to start getting merged.
It just got merged.
Yeah, so great, that's awesome. But it's really scary. Like imagine in anyone's job here, if you're working, and it happens in people's jobs, you're working on something for years and maybe your boss calls one day, it's like, nope, we're canceling that. And you're just like, oh, yeah, you still got paid, okay, but your work is just sort of tossed out. And especially for like a business, I can imagine businesses not wanting to really get behind and put a lot of resources into something where it's very uncertain if it will ever happen. Because that's more researchy. So that just tends to slow things down even more with Bitcoin. Like you don't want to develop things you don't know are going to happen, and it's hard to get consensus for things that might not be that useful. I personally think OpsCTV might be getting towards the point where we're seeing a bunch. Nothing's out there and really coded and like very well developed, but we have enough ideas that are like, hey, wait, this seems to use OpsCTV and work better, and this other thing, and it's sort of over the couple years, you're seeing more and more utility for it, and it's like, yeah, nothing's finished, nothing's built, but to me, it's like, yeah, this is pretty convincing that this could be a useful thing. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but like, I hope we do get something like that. So.
Yeah, and perhaps it's exactly because this could be useful that the risks that we were talking about earlier make it not worth it, the trade-off to try and push that through.
I also need to point out, I mean, one of the big categories of things we want to do this is stuff like channel factories that ultimately want to go scale Lightning even further. And we have not seen Lightning's failure modes. And a really important one is that if a lot of channels go to chain, in a short period of time, you can run out of block space. And you can be in a situation where people lose a lot of money because they just could not get the right transactions on chain to do things like, implement justice transactions and so on. And this could be a disaster, and it's a much bigger risk if Lightning scales further. Now, does that mean we never do it? Not necessarily, but it would build a lot more confidence if Lightning was pushed to a much further limit, and if we'd seen some of these failure modes play out in reality. Like, good example is, let's suppose hypothetically, like Phoenix screws up, and every single Phoenix channel in the world goes to chain. If we see that happen and work through it, and everything's fine, that'll give you more confidence that, hey, maybe we can push Lightning further. If that happens and it's disaster, maybe we need to rethink things. And we just don't know that yet, because these things haven't happened yet.
So I think if we want covenants so that we can make channel factories, the step one is to do a denial of service attack on Phoenix, so we can show what happens since we don't have channel factories.
Yeah. Oh no,
right.
I think
You
that's
have your marching
actually a
orders,
legit,
devs.
although slightly evil
kidding.
thing to do. But yeah, that would actually give more confidence. I'm not saying you should. My lawyer says no, but it would probably work.
Okay, thanks, Peter Todd, for defining the theme of the next hackathon, which is in a bit.
It is sort of interesting how Lightning is not really that adversarial. Like, there was an attack posted, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or something, and I was looking at it, I was like, yeah, maybe. There's ways that things can go wrong, but it's a weird thing. It's sort of unlike Bitcoin, where everything's sort of anonymous. In Lightning, you do have like a channel partner, and you're not trusting them with your money exactly, but you are sort of hoping that they stay online. And if they go offline, that's kind of annoying. And so you do have this like somewhat relationship and things. And so it's not that adversarial. You can find things, like I'm sure if you try to go out and crash Lightning nodes, you'll probably be able to fairly easily. Like there's bugs in it and stuff. But the bugs probably won't make people lose money, but maybe it's just crashing or stuff. But it's not nearly as adversarial of stuff we're used to, or I'm used, in like Bitcoin world, where yeah, people are trying to steal money, people are trying to crash. They are in Lightning, but because you're sort of partnered, it tones it down a little bit.
I mean, I think one of the failures of the Lightning implementations to date is actually that they don't expose the ability to go and deliberately trigger adversarial modes. Like great examples like LND. Like there's no easy way in LND to go trigger a justice transaction. And there should be. Because you want people to go try this stuff out. You want people to go experiment. You want people to see what breaks. Because otherwise you build much bigger things than you otherwise would have.
Yeah, but I could
that
see
aren't
how
necessarily very good.
I could see how the try to steal money RPC call would be people would complain a lot. It's like, I tried to steal money, but it didn't work, and I lost all my money, and then they complain to roast beef.
Well, I hate to say this, but if you typed
Lesson learned.
LNCLI, try to steal money, that's on you.
I mean, that would be a fun
I would
call.
be a fan. I want that feature.
I mean, it is a good call for testing, right? Because that's one of the things working with Lightning. It's like, well, we haven't really tested a lot of these. I don't know, do justice transactions ever actually happen on mainnet? Like, basically, yes, but only because of bugs, right? So, like, it is
people
a sort
trying
of,
it out.
People trying it out with themselves or something like that. But there isn't a ton of like really adversarial use, and that might become like what you're saying. Like that might be coming. It's sort of same with Bitcoin. When Bitcoin was really little, like people weren't really banging on it that hard, and then it starts getting big, and then like people start trying to attack.
I mean, double spending unconfirmed transactions is your classic example where it was a real pain to do it because wallets didn't have support for it. And that has gradually changed. And sure enough, a whole lot of people have lost a lot of money because they had terrible implementations that never worked.
Yeah, I wanted to bring back a little to the topic of soft forks. I think we did touch a lot on the testing and try and break it just a little bit. Don't break it too hard, but try and break it. And I think that's also something that soft forks are all about, right? You do some testing and then you try and change, and the change should theoretically be beneficial. Now, bringing it back to the covenants discussion, I know, Tadge, you briefly mentioned SIG hash no input, or APO now as it's called. It seems very similar to CTV, but also very different. I'd be interested to know, and perhaps the audience too, like, how can we compare the two, and what are the differences, similarities?
Yeah, so any prev out or no input sort of lets you have a signature that can be used among different transactions. And that's it's different in that you sort of add flexibility, whereas OpCTV sort of restricts the flexibility. But there are cases where they can be used interchangeably. So in some kinds of like L2 and things like that, you can use them interchangeably. I sort of feel like any prev-out stuff has been around for so long that I'm like less, just in terms of like my guess is that it's probably not going to happen because it hasn't really changed in, I don't know, 5 or 6 or so years. And people had sort of worries about it And I disagree with those worries. I'm like, oh, come on. We can't babysit people. Because one of the first worries, like, people said, oh, people could lose money. They could reuse an address. And if you reuse an address with any pre-vout, you could lose money. And that's true, but it's like, well, don't reuse addresses. Like, don't do the dangerous thing that makes this bad. But people have worried about it for years. Whereas OpCTV does feel like it's a bit newer and maybe has more momentum behind it. I don't know.
I mean, to be clear, like, with Lightning, if you go and start making payments to addresses that come up as part of Lightning channels, you basically are almost certainly going to lose money because you're paying to addresses that aren't really valid addresses in the way you would normally think of them. And, I would agree with you, like that concern for, sig hash no input, it's a ridiculous concern because it really falls down to, you really shouldn't do that and the risk is already there anyway. Although, in terms of sig hash no input not having so many use cases, I mean, I actually do have one that I need to go write an article on, so I think it's more useful than people used to think it was.
I mean, I'm for both of them, so yeah. I think I'm like less conservative than many others in terms of like, I feel like the, one soft fork every 5 years is not the best. I feel like they should be not as big of a deal until we, because it makes it feel like more political. Like, okay, now we're doing the next soft fork, and it's like this big thing that's like the 5-year plan for Bitcoin, and that's like inherently political. I think if it was a bit more free and like, oh, here's a cool idea, like, yeah, we can do that this year or something.
Like more organic and
I mean, it's hard because it's bigger. Like, it used to be that way, right? Like, in 2013, 14, there were soft forks, some of which were, like, kind of scary, like eval and stuff like that, where I remember people would come on GitHub and they're like, you need to learn how Bitcoin works before you destroy it. There was a time, like maybe 2014 to 15, where it's like, yeah, you have people, you get consensus, like technical know-how, and then it, like, can happen fairly easily without a huge like multi-year process.
Well, I think that gets back down into like how do you actually activate them? And of course, you go back far enough, Satoshi would just go release code that didn't say in the release notes or the Git commits what on earth it had changed while making enormous changes. I mean, a really funny example of this is the white paper itself is wrong. The white paper says that the longest chain is the valid chain. And that is fundamentally broken. And Satoshi changed this completely unbeknownst to everyone to the most work chain in a Git commit that says something like, I don't know, like fix build system or something.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think, who knows, but I don't think the concept of soft forks and hard forks was really around. I mean, Satoshi said in the blog says, oh, we can introduce it later and stuff. I don't think whoever made this like really understood what soft forks and hard forks were, because it's an emergent property of these things.
Great example of this is Bitcoin was released with an opcode called opver, which pushed the version of the code you were running to the stack. So if you and I had different code, it would immediately, different
Split.
version of Bitcoin, and opver was used, it would immediately fork. It was completely busted.
I mean, op return true. Yeah, there's lots of things in the beginning that nobody knew these things. And so I think that the concept, I think the term soft fork, hard fork sort of came 2013-ish, a bit later. And now it's
probably 2012.
2012,
probably.
okay. So it's, we're learning more about it. And even today, we're learning about confidence and learning all these things while we're trying to build them. So
I want to bring back opver. If we can get that back into Bitcoin, it's even more powerful than opcat.
yeah,
Just destroy the entire network, one transaction.
everyone has their own blockchain after that.
No. Everyone just runs the same code all the time. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
So just to tie it back and finalize the discussion between APO, which you touched on, and CTV, I wanted to understand, perhaps from you, Super Testnet, do you think OpCTV is better or more ready than APO to activate?
No, I don't think it's better or more ready than APO. I think they're both in a position where they could be activated. In fact, they are on two of our signets, MutinyNet and the Inquisition Signet are two of the popular test networks that we use in Bitcoin, and both of them have support for both of these soft forks, which is really nice because you can start building software that uses them and show this is what we could have, on Bitcoin. So I think they're both in a position where they could be easily deployed.
So how does one, for example, Jeremy is out, right? But a lot of people seem to agree with you that, hey, these two might be ready. What's the next step, right?
So I think one of the hard parts is even with Taproot, where like OpsCTV and APO, I think there's still a bit, there's a lot more, uncertainty and like, do people want it or not? But with something like Taproot, pretty much everyone was like, yeah, this is great, let's do it. And it still was discussion.
I mean, to be more clear, I think, again, this gets back to, it wasn't just that it was great, it was obviously we should have done this from day zero.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
that's
remember
how Bitcoin script should have been.
reading on the mailing list the equation, the pay to contract hash equation, and I was like, oh, how did we not think of that? That's great, And so it was very like, yeah, we need this, and it's still, the discussion of activation took years. And my analogy is like, imagine you're with your friends, and you're like, okay, we know where we're going to dinner. We all decided we're going to get pizza. We know where we're going to get pizza. Everyone's in agreement. And then you spend years, well, how do we know how to get there? What if someone gets there before everyone else and thinks we're not going there anymore and then goes home? And it's just like years of that discussion. You're like, oh, geez, can't you just activate it? But I guess not.
Although, I got to point out, I think that the reason why Taproot had an activation discussion, it was a reasonable reason. And, again, going back to my own soft fork, opt, check, lockdown, verify, the way it was activated was at a time when I think there was a lot less politics involved, and we simply said, well, why don't we have miners go signal that they're running it, and when like 95% of blocks in the past, 2 weeks or whatever it is, say, yeah, we're running this, we say that miners should go and actually activate the rule and kick off blocks that, do not uphold OpsCLTV rules. Right? And the problem there is that sounds like miners are voting for it. And a lot of people don't like miners be voting. Well, why? Well, because SegWit. SegWit was a situation where SegWit was proposed as that same kind of rule. Miners signal that they're supporting it, and if enough miners do, you kick off non-SegWit miners, but then miners didn't want to go activate it. And then there was a whole other side of it, which is, well, why don't we do a user-activated soft fork, where we simply distribute software to users that after a certain point in time will just kick off miners that do not follow SegWit rules. Now, that's not to say that they have to mine SegWit transactions. They could just not mine them. But any miner that mines a block that would be invalid under SegWit would not be accepted. The problem is, how do you know how many users are actually running the user-activated soft fork? Like, you just don't. There is no good way to know this. And it's not even like number of users, it's really economic transactions, right? Because obviously, I personally happen to go run something like 20, 30 nodes for technical reasons. But those nodes are not important, right? They're things I do for various experiments. What really matters
They're important to me, Todd.
Yeah. Well, but more importantly, like, most of those nodes don't matter. All that matters is a financial activity I do. And that is much less proportionally than the number of nodes I run. So, UASFs are scary, scary, scary things, because if they fail badly, suddenly the whole community is plunged into chaos, well, who should do what? And then that's how Taproot had this discussion all happened, because people wanted to reuse a miner activated thing, but other people would say, no, this sets a bad precedent, because now we're saying miners are in control. And, it just kind of goes on from there. And eventually, I think ultimately miners activated it. Yeah.
But it is scary, right? If you don't, right now, everyone who's used Bitcoin has never had this problem where you're like, oh, I have a Bitcoin. No, you don't. We've maintained consensus for years and years and years, the software works. But that's what we're talking about when we're worrying about soft forks, is maybe your computer sees Bitcoin and someone else's computer doesn't see it or sees a different balance. So.
And, Lightning makes this problem so much worse, because Lightning channels, at least if I'm just paying you on chain and you and I disagree, you can run both versions of the software and there's a reasonable conclusion. Lightning doesn't work that way. On Lightning, if you run sort of both versions of the software on different Lightning nodes, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, you can only run one.
Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, you make sure that consensus stays, and everything sort of breaks if it doesn't. So yeah.
I'd like to co-opt that meme we used in Taproot. But can we just say this about OpsCTV? Everyone agrees that we should get OpsCTV, The only disagreement is how do we get opctv? That was my favorite part about the Taproot drama was just like, oh, we're just not going to argue about whether to activate it. Great. We'll just talk about how to do it.
Yeah, I think that people still argue. I don't know. Like I wouldn't be surprised if this happens, but I also wouldn't be surprised if like we never get any more soft forks and we're just like, oh, we're stuck. That could happen.
Well, we're definitely going to get one more fork, which is in 2130 when the end time field overflows and Bitcoin ceases to exist. But maybe before that we don't get any.
Yeah, but that'll be 100-something years, so maybe we're okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely not sleep today thinking about that. But
I will also say for everyone in the audience, like, people who work on Bitcoin all the time worry about it way more than anyone else. So like I don't want to be like negative and everyone's like, oh, Bitcoin's going to die. Because I have heard that from audience people like sometimes before when I've like talked about all these problems. But you have to understand that like all I deal with is problems in Bitcoin, and probably you too. And so like the fact that it actually works is like awesome, that's great. And then like, okay, but what about this problem? So yeah, like probably everything's fine, but all we worry about is like these edge cases that could kill the whole thing.
maybe everything is fine, right?
Seems like it so far.
Don't worry too much.
Exactly. Everything will be fine. But yeah, I wanted to expand a little bit something that Super Testnet touched on, which is the activation mechanism. I know we already discussed a lot of it, but it does seem that there is no consensus on what activation mechanism should be used when the time comes for the next soft fork. So I wanted to get kind of like the sense of how each one of you are navigating this type of discussion.
My opinion, miners have done enough penance from their sins of not activating SegWit, and we can let them have this one. You can activate opctv for us, and we'll be okay with it. That's my opinion.
I kind of agree, maybe for a different reason, is that the user-activated soft fork stuff was really scary, and to me, during the whole SegWit thing, I was like, well, look, if it doesn't activate, it doesn't activate, right? Like, we didn't have consensus, so we don't change it, so that's that. And so I was sort of still on the, yes, miners have a veto, and we might not like that, but it's safer just to go with that way.
I think it depends on the soft fork. It depends on how important it is and what the risks trade-offs are. Like, I think with SegWit, the risks of a user-acted soft fork were worth it because Lightning is just that important. For CTV, I'm not so sure about that. For my own opcode, I want to go propose op expire. I'm really not sure about that because it's not remotely got enough technical consensus. But it is possible, maybe tomorrow, the thing in Lightning that it's meant to go fix suddenly gets exploited en masse. And maybe a bunch of people agree, yeah, user-activated software, we got to do that tomorrow to try to get this thing to go through so Lightning continues to work again. We don't know what that will look like, and it will totally depend on the soft fork.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the hard part, is that so many points across the spectrum of how, why, and when to do a soft fork are so subjective, right? From the technical consensus, which is sometimes it is kind of like when you're there kind of a thing, but also to the politics, right? And so it comes out to reputations, whether we want to or not.
Well, this 2130 hard fork, I think that's not going to be a big deal at all because Bitcoin literally ceases to exist if we cannot get consensus over how to go fix that. Surely in the 2 decades before that, we'll have some simple, obvious hard fork. Everyone will implement it, and it won't be a big deal.
Yeah, but there isn't really a process, right? There's no, and that was something that Jeremy argued about and other people too. Like, hey, what is the process here? There's no official process. There is sort of an official Bitcoin repo, but even then they're like, well, this is just an implementation, but don't make another implementation, and we don't like the other implementation. So it's like a weird, there's sort of, there is in practice sort of a group that's in charge, but not really, and they don't want to be.
Well, it's notable how, other coins do not have these issues because they're quite happy to be centralized at the development level. In the technical aspects of all these forks, the way that they're done in Bitcoin is actually really simple. Other than getting consensus, we're very confident all these upgrades work very easily and the mechanism we use to turn them on is robust. There really are no concerns there other than this meta-political thing of how the hell do you decide who's in charge? Yeah. If we said, yeah, Bitcoin Core's in charge, that would be easy. But that's a sketchy thing to do.
And even
because
the
it invites
people,
lawsuits.
Yeah, even the people working there, working on Taproot, were like, okay, here's the code. I'm not, I'm not touching it. Like no one's in, like everyone's like, I'm not in charge, so no one wants to push it forward.
With the SegWit UASF, like the people who pushed it were deliberately not the people involved directly in Bitcoin Core, and that was a good thing.
Yeah, I think exactly. We're running out of time, so just to sum it up, I think that's the main takeaway is that since there is no one in charge, that's actually a good thing.
It's good, but it makes it really hard. But that's how it has to be.
It's why we Bitcoin, but it does have some downsides.
Exactly. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.